You know, you can't really operate those in that market without a VPN. If the Chinese government turns around and says, no, we don't want Android in China, no one has a choice.
No, I'm sure
if the US can restrict Huawei in America, then
totally. I'm sure they can do it. It just might exhaust. They might decide that's not the best way to exhaust whatever reserves of goodwill it has with its own population. But
I mean, I'm not entirely convinced the Chinese government gives a what goodwill it has with the Chinese people either. So.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. I'm joined this week by the core crew of Jamie and Iain, as we've all finished flying around all over the place or just dossing or whatever we were doing, I can't even remember. Just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on Facebook or on YouTube, you can listen to it on SoundCloud or iTunes or countless other platforms and vice versa. Right, this week we're going to talk, both of you two went to an E5G launch event earlier on this week. Yeah. And so 5G seems to finally be hitting the UK, so we'll head off with that. We're going to talk inevitably, and do you know what, I'm not even going to apologise for it anymore. Every week something dramatic happens with Huawei and the US.
Has to be
it's got to be spoken about, so there we are, we're getting that again. And then we're going to finish off with some more sort of US side stuff, another ongoing saga of whether or not T-Mobile US and Sprint are going to be allowed to get into holy wedlock or whatever we call it. And yes, so the 5G thing, I'm not going to witter on because I wasn't at that event. I'll hand it over to you first, Jamie, because you're obviously in the middle of your research for this topic. You went and heard about EE's 5G plans for the UK. Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, it looks pretty comprehensive, to be honest with you. Vodafone launched first in terms of got their deadline date out to the market, but they've essentially been undercut by EE. So May 30th is the switch on date for the actual 5G networks. Okay. So you can actually start pre-ordering phones, tariffs, and it does actually look pretty good. I mean, I had a little bit of a scan around the EE website this morning, and where they are actually launching it does look quite comprehensive, aside from London. I think Cardiff, Belfast, for instance, and Edinburgh are pretty, but the actual downtown areas are pretty much blanketed with 5G.
Okay, so you're talking about the sort of street level sort of coverage map.
Geographical coverage, which is pretty, and it looks pretty comprehensive in those cities. But obviously with London, I mean, just the sheer scale London is in comparison to other cities around the UK, it's just nowhere near as comprehensive.
And we should note that before we started recording, Pierre was expressing scepticism because he hasn't seen dudes up on towers nailing up 5G stuff.
Yeah, so big 5G banners up.
Yeah, exactly.
Gets it here.
Sorry, go on.
But no, but it does look pretty. It does look pretty comprehensive. They said the first phase is going to be just sort of like rolling out in the very busiest of areas, and I think they're going to be, what did they say, 15, 16 cities or 10 cities by the end of the year. Yeah. They're upgrading 100 sites every single month, and by the end of 2019, they'll have 1,500 sites which are upgraded to 5G connectivity. Okay. Then phase 2 is.
Phase 2 is.
I can't remember phase 2.
So phase 2 is 2022.
Yeah.
And that's when they basically introduce a new core.
That's right. Right. And that's where you get genuine 5G. And that's when you start 5G.
To go beyond the sort of enhanced. So enhanced mobile broadband is basically what BT's 5G proposition is going to be for the next few years. Yeah. And then 2022 we get the new core coming in. And then 2023 onwards is like phase 3, which is when they start to basically build on the core and do mission critical, and
that's where the low latency play comes in.
Yes.
Yeah. But that 2022 is quite a big sort of transition apparently, because they need to get everybody off the kind of existing core network onto this new one. And the idea of that new core is that it will support 4G and the 2 versions of 5G, which are kind of non-standalone and standalone.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the interesting
small undertaking.
The interesting thing about it is they're actually going to be launching, and I don't know whether people are just ignoring this on purpose or whether the PR team have done a wonderful job of sort of covering this up. But it's going to, despite all the security concerns around Huawei, 5G for EE is going to be launched with a Huawei core. As part of the network, so they haven't phased out Huawei.
Oh, yeah.
It is the core of the network for the next 3 years is going to be Huawei.
Well, I think they've not they've not been making a noise about it because obviously it looks. I think the thing that came out is that how long that's still going to be, because they said they were going to start stripping out Huawei from the core last year, and that it could be quite a long process. But like looking at the slides and talking to Howard Watson, it's basically that introduction of the new core. 2022 is how long Huawei's going to be there in the core, and they're kind of providing 5G services over that, and
we'll obviously get more into the Huawei narrative in a bit, but presumably, even all the sort of geopolitical considerations and this ban and all this stuff. I mean, everyone's got to understand that you can't just swap this stuff out overnight.
No, it's really difficult to kind of make that transition. And they haven't even chosen who the new core network provider is going to be.
Kind of running out of
so they're
options.
in trials at the moment with Cisco, Ericsson, and Nokia. And it's looking more likely to be Nokia, I think.
Right.
But and they've kind of got, so their two radio vendors are Huawei and Nokia at the moment. So they already kind of have a relationship with Nokia. But obviously that's still to be decided. They haven't kind of reached a decision on what to.
That'll stop people saying that Nokia's falling behind in 5G, won't it?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, and what about the date? And I noticed when I was reading Jamie's report there were no Huawei 5G handsets. Is that right? Did we think that was a particularly pointed thing or what?
I mean the way Alera said why effectively that happens is because they can't guarantee that the phone will work properly on Android for the 2-year period of the contract. So the mobile contract that customers sign with EE, to say unless we can actually guarantee you that there's going to be an effective experience that's going to be had from day one through to for 24 months.
That's a really good point.
We're not going to actually sell those phones. So I mean it's the same with Vodafone because
so they didn't want to talk about it.
They didn't want to talk about it. So Vodafone I'm just in the middle of putting together something now on their tariffs, and Huawei has been stripped off their website. So they are only selling 2 phones and this smart hub, which I think you can connect your 4G phone to.
Is that Huawei, that smart hub?
No.
Because I know BT has a Huawei like router sort of CPE.
They had originally. I was looking this up. So I wrote a story yesterday afternoon that Vodafone was going to have. I don't think it was going to be as big a set piece event as the EE one that you guys went to, but they were certainly going to have a media briefing. They're trying to downplay it and call it an informal media briefing. I don't know what an informal media briefing means.
No, I mean
it's either a media briefing or it isn't. But anyway, they were going to have an informal media briefing today, and they bailed at the last minute. And it's clearly because
we were
of
told
all
they
this.
wkind of hand. We got in touch with them yesterday, and the latest we got was they're having some sort of handset thing. We were told, weren't we? And that a proper sort of big kind of announcement would come later.
But on all the tariff stuff came out this morning.
But the tariff stuff all came out, as well as some deal they've done.
I think they're doing. My guess is they're doing a bit of firefighting. They've made the executive decision that because of all the Huawei craziness, that perhaps they better just not go there. And now they're trying to make out that it wasn't a very big event in the first place, but I don't think they'd be downplaying it if they were still running it. Obviously,
they were going to get asked the same questions that BT got asked, and they just sort of faced up to it and came out and. People are going to make more of a fuss about Vodafone because they've cancelled something.
We fill the vacuum with our idle speculation.
Exactly.
Yes, I mean, I think it is the last minuteness of the cancellation as well that always, from a journalist's point of view, you're like, hello, what's going on here? This is clearly not something that's been planned and choreographed and scheduled.
I think the other thing is on the BT side, and this would affect Vodafone as well, because I mean Vodafone's talked about this a lot, but the impact of a kind of more comprehensive Huawei ban or the impact of supply chain restrictions. And whether that could delay the 5G rollout. So as Jamie said, they're kind of rolling out 100 sites a month, and BT is really heavily dependent on Huawei in urban areas. That's basically the urban supplier, and Nokia does kind of the sort of non-urban stuff. So, if the question got asked, and Alera said, well, it kind of sort of depends on, we're kind of monitoring it, depends on what the government review says, and then I asked Howard Watson later, and he said, well, there might be a chance that we end up bringing in a third vendor to kind of deal with things if there is some kind of big issue there.
It's such a volatile,
it's
constantly
really volatile,
moving situation, isn't it?
So does it slow down the plans? Does it slow down the 5G rollout? It's still kind of
good question.
up in the air.
Well, before we sort of dive further into that Huawei thing, although it's one of those things that's now...
Huawei says it can cope with the supply chain stuff, doesn't it? That's what they've been saying recently.
Yeah, and they've stockpiled stuff. But it now overlaps so much with everything else. It's really hard when I'm trying to steer the podcast. It's really hard not to. It's like some kind of black hole that sucks all other news towards it.
Yeah.
But I will persevere nonetheless, because one thing I do want to ask about before we go all in on Huawei is this 5G. So E's the first to have an event, and they're going to be the first to flick the switch. But Vodafone's not going to be long after. Yeah. Don't think we've heard much from the other two. What are you guys?
End of the year, weren't you, Jamie, for O2?
O2 is supposedly towards the end of the year, but 3 is already...
3's next year, I think.
3's said 2020.
Right.
Yeah, they've basically said we're not going to try and beat anybody. We're just going to kind of come in and be the
do
best
it when we're ready.
And undercut everybody on price, basically.
Okay.
I mean, this is the thing, though. But I mean, Vodafone and EE have given everyone the opportunity to undercut on price. I mean, because it's bloody expensive. I mean, one of the things that might be worth keeping an eye on is the uptake of 5G contracts. And it'd be useful to see in 6 months' time, whether a digital divide has been created, that the haves and have nots of 5G. When you look at, is it the affluent demographics that are really taking 5G contracts and leaving the poorer demographics on sort of 4G? 5G is supposed to be this wonderful thing for all of society.
Right.
It's supposed to be completely democratise connectivity. But at the current price, entry level contracts are 50 quid for 5 gigabyte of data, and considering how data intensive a lot of 5G applications are actually going to be, you'll burn through that 5 gigabytes in no time.
So we do
whatsoever.
think that they're charging a premium. I mean, you'd expect them to, but then hadn't there been some messaging that at least one operator wasn't going to charge a premium?
Vodafone, there was supposed to be some rumours.
Yeah, they said they were going to price it at the same level as 4G, but that doesn't seem to be the case, looking at the... BT looks expensive.
I don't see why you wouldn't try and charge a premium.
Well, I think you try and do it at first, and then prices fall really quickly, don't they? Because the people, as you're saying, other people come into the market. You've got the challenge.
You're always going to want to sting the early adopters a bit, aren't you?
And it's
so expensive, though. I mean, if you actually look at a reasonable contract, I mean, let's be honest, 5 gigabyte isn't a reasonable contract when the sort of like some of the intensity of some of these applications that we've got nowadays. But if you actually have a look at a reasonable contract, 15 gigabytes is, if you get the Samsung device, it's going to be £62 a month plus £100 up front for the Vodafone tariffs. Yeah. I mean, I don't think EE is particularly different from that. And then, there's some for the data.
Total cost of ownership coming close to about £1,500.
I think it's a waste of money.
It's too much for the moment. It's a waste for the moment.
Until the applications start to come along. And this is one of the things that the press conference that Jamie and I were at, they're talking a bit about some of the services that they kind of expect to be able to support on 5G networks in future. So they had the guy, the CEO of Niantic there, which is a gaming company, who's been doing some kind of...
Pokemon Go they did.
They've been doing trials with Deutsche Telekom of kind of services that require low latency connections in future. And they're talking a lot about this Wizards Unite game that's coming out fairly soon, which is like Harry Potter type. A bit like Pokemon Go, you go around you'll see little kids running around with their smartphones doing this in a weird way because their parents have got them a 5G connection. But they obviously want to try and talk up these services that need 5G. And the guy from Niantic very helpfully said, we really need 5G for this stuff to work.
Well, I don't know whether... it depends where you are, though. I mean, if you're in sort of like a non-urban environment and you've got a stable 4G connection, these augmented reality applications will work. It's when you come into central London and you're trying to run sort of an AR application, and the network the base station is highly congested with a couple of thousand people already. That's when it's not going to work. But it does actually look like, like Pokemon Go, they build it as AR, but it was effectively just a sticker on the camera and on the environment. This actually does look to be more truer to the definition of AR, in that the inserted sort of characters and actually interact with the environment.
Right.
So it does look to be a more truer AR experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that is what they're counting on, isn't it? So, as Iain said, they're not even going to get into the clever stuff with the core that's going to unlock some of the other potential of 5G for a few years. So we're just looking at enhanced mobile broadband. So obviously they've got to try and find applications, games, services, whatever, that require a much fatter pipe than we got now. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah. I mean, let's not forget there is a cost efficiency play for the operators here. Delivering data over 5G is substantially, the transmissions costs for operators is cheaper than compared to 4G. So the more people theoretically, the more people you translate or move on to a 5G tariff, the less money the operators have to pay in terms of delivering connectivity. So there is a benefit from for the spreadsheets from an efficiency point.
But in terms of how they get,
so that's not value add.
So you've just gone to launch events, which I presume they're hoping that coverage is going to generate some degree of consumer buzz for 5G, and the only way they're going to get consumers to pay a premium for 5G is if there are services that require.
Well, I think there'll always be people who want 5G. They want the latest thing. It's the same. You go and buy a car, and your neighbour goes and buys one that looks better because they just want to sort of have bragging rights that they've got 5G handsets, and they'll pick up those people straight away. So,
I mean, the really interesting. I mean, from looking at the EE bundles, there are some interesting ideas there in terms of you can swap in and out benefits. So there's like 5 benefits to choose from, and it's like all 0 rating offerings. So like one is music, one is video, one is like
Netflix,
and there's like a little store of them.
Yes, you can watch. So you can watch as much Netflix as you want, and it doesn't count against your data allowance.
That's quite novel.
Like that.
Yeah, it's a good idea. And then you can swap them in and out each month. I'm assuming at the end of every month you activate these swappable benefits over the course of that month. They build.
So if you're on a bus in Cardiff, you're fine, but if you're doing a journey across Wales, you're screwed.
Which in so many ways. What was I going to say?
But it does look good. I mean, the actual phase plan.
It's growing on me.
EE's plan for actually delivering 5G, it looks comprehensive and it looks sensible.
Yeah. No,
so
I got that from your write-up, that you credit where it's due. And as you say, the interesting thing will be, by the end of this year or going into next year, what kind of uptake there is.
Yeah, I mean, whether that digital divide has been created.
There's that as well, and just whether, apart from extreme sort of maniacal early adopters, whether anyone's that bothered.
Yeah.
I can't really talk because I don't think I had 4G until it been around for 5-7 years. So I'm certainly not an early adopter.
Most people aren't going to be. Most people are going to take the time to.
And do you think there's much pressure on them?
The other thing is the upgrade cycle, I suppose, with devices. You know, because we keep talking about that lengthening, and people aren't as keen these days to come by because they don't see the. I'm not sure.
Sometimes the new generation, certainly from a sort of handset vendor's point of view, they hope that a new generation resets the upgrade cycle a little bit.
But they kind of try to bring out new features to accompany it, don't
they? Or foldy phones or whatever.
Well, that device we saw at the press conference is quite impressive, wasn't it? That
the
LG one that you were
event.
fiddling around with.
Yeah, the LG device was really, really good. Basically, it's just a bog standard phone, obviously with a 5G antenna in it, but it comes with a module that is essentially just like a little book. And you clip it into the module, and you've got 2 independent screens.
Okay.
So you can have a video on one side, and you can be working on your emails directly below.
So it's like a screen dock rather than a foldy screen.
Yeah. Right. But then and then it works from a gaming perspective. So you can actually have he showed us an example of some car racing game, and you actually have the video, the screen on top with where you're going, but you have all the controls for the car on the second screen.
Yeah.
And that,
that's right. You had a photo of it.
Yeah. And I think
he was the head of LG for the UK, wasn't he?
He was quite a senior
guy doing a little demo,
and
he was the bloke who was in charge of the whole business in the UK.
Yeah, Andrew Coughlin. He was senior LG.
If you want something done properly.
But I mean, it opens up a completely new gaming experience, because some of these games are quite frustrating because you have the controls on the actual screen. So if you can actually separate the control function from the actual gameplay function with 2 separate independently working screens, there's a whole new type of game that you can create, and you've got all of a sudden you've just got a huge amount of real estate to work with. But then you can pop it out of the module if you just want it to be a normal phone. It's really good.
It's quite heavy, but it looked good, didn't it? And it seemed to work well.
I mean, they just said we have designed this for multitaskers.
Okay.
For the commuters who want to do 2 different things at the same time, or people who want to, not necessarily commuters, but people in their living room or something like that. It is specifically designed for a very, very niche audience. But I really like the look of it, and I'd be tempted to get one and try it out.
So are you going to get a 5G connection?
No,
in the next few weeks?
No, I'm not. Not unless E or Vodafone give it me for free.
Scott, probably
No,
not. Does it take you 7 years to get 4G?
Yes, quite. But then I could feel that I was missing out in terms of sort of mobile broadband bandwidth.
Yeah.
I'm just not so convinced that right now, when I get a proper robust 4G connection, which isn't always the case, even now. Sorry EE, but sometimes
like
it looks like I'm getting 4G and then nothing's going on.
Just use Wi-Fi, mate.
Well, I often do.
But what would make you rush out and get 5G if there was some application that someone said you desperately...
Yeah, I don't think the bandwidth alone. That's my point. When I get the full-blown 4G, which before it sounds like I'm dissing E too much. It normally is fine.
Yeah.
Then I'm never thinking I wish I had more bandwidth.
Yeah.
But then this is always the argument. People always go, "Oh, how can we possibly need more?" Back in the 80s, how could we need more than sort of 128 megabytes of RAM or whatever?
Well, you get more,
people always find a way of using
it.
But as you say, I'm trying to think of what someone used. I suppose.
But this was exactly the same as the 4G world, wasn't it? I mean, 4G didn't take off with a screen like everyone anticipated. But they've
got to start somewhere.
Yeah, it took 2 or 3 years for the applications to emerge, and then everyone sort of upgraded to a 4G.
Yeah.
I suppose to try and answer Ian's question, if I got if something was 0 rated or I got an uncapped tariff, and I was able to do some quite cool stuff with sort of streaming video as and when, or just live TV or whatever. Maybe when Wimbledon's on or something like that, and there was some way in which I had a superior viewing experience through 5G. No, then that might be a driver. But I'd have to not be worried about using up my data allowance.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll probably just upgrade when my next upgrade's due, and when it's just become a bit easier and the prices have fallen, which is going to be when all 4 operators are in the market, and and that's kind of how I did it with 4G, I think.
Yeah,
a couple
I think
of years
we all
into
will.
it.
Fair enough. So, onto the actual Huawei thing. The big news this week. So last week when we went over it, it was this Trump executive order, followed by this entity list, which is basically a list of companies. That if a US company wants to do business with them, they've got to basically get a note from teacher to be allowed to do it. Yeah. And then we were like, Jamie wrote a piece right at the end of last week going, keep an eye on that because that's going to be the big one, and he was totally right.
I think that's so much more important than Huawei not being able to sell into the US. So much more important.
Well, and so it's been proven to be the case this week with a bunch of other people distancing themselves from Huawei, and by far the most significant of those is Google, because they own Android, on which all Huawei phones, such as the one Jamie's so fond of, run. And now, just to clarify what the situation is with Android, it is an open source thing, but if you want to use the Google Play Store and you want to install Google apps sort of natively on the phone and all that sort of thing, then you need to get a license from Google. So you can still go ahead.
The other thing to factor in there is security as well, because security updates are given to licensed Android companies weeks before it's rolled out through the open source community.
Quite, and presumably a sort of forked version is much more vulnerable.
Yes.
So yeah, that's a good point. So basically,
this is one of the reasons BT and EE sort of backing off, because the security side is really a big concern for them. I suppose.
Yes, well, and as one of you two said, if they can't be sure that this is going to be a sort of viable handset for the duration of the 2-year contract, then they're just preemptively not getting involved.
Yeah.
So the thing is, well, we could go off. Well, it's got a few options. If it does get cut off from licensing Google stuff, it can just fork Android, which I think it's already done to some extent in China already, because there's a bunch of Google stuff I don't think you're allowed to put on handsets in China. And that might work in China because there's not such a big change. Or apparently it's developing its own operating system as well, which is fine. You can do that, but I certainly know from my smartphone analyst past that perfectly decent operating systems like Windows Phone eventually turned into quite a decent operating system, but by that stage it was just a duopoly, and the market had no appetite for any other. Same goes for BlackBerry.
There's been more recent attempts to try and crack in, haven't there, as well?
Yeah, Samsung's had Tizen ticking around.
Not gone anywhere. Yeah.
I mean, I honestly, I think it'll, if they are forced into running their own operating system, I believe that it'll be really tough for the first couple of years, but I think it will succeed. And I think a Huawei operating system will dominate the Asia market. Android will continue to dominate the Western markets.
Yeah.
And then you have Apple kicking around with iOS.
Yeah, doing its Apple thing as ever.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting perspective. So certainly my experience in the past, maybe deeply sceptical that a third one could survive. But your perspective of sort of balkanizing the market and having certain regions where a third platform is tolerated. I don't think it would be tolerated in the West, in the US and in Europe. But yeah, in Asia, and of course the Chinese state is going to take as active a role as it can in helping Huawei out and helping its national champions out. So
I mean,
yes.
the other thing you've got to consider is very much the Chinese government. Well, will they force, with the creation of I can't remember what it's called. It's called like Huawei or something like that, isn't it? OS.
Oh right, yeah.
The
Project Z.
Yeah,
apparently.
But they, would they force the likes of Xiaomi, Oppo, OnePlus onto this new operating system? And even if it does only exist in China, let's not forget that China accounts for just over or just under a sixth of the world's population. That is a big enough market
It's the biggest
to
smartphone
sustain
market.
its own OS exclusively.
It is definitely the biggest smartphone market. But then the question there is, let's say the Chinese state gets really interventionist and authoritarian and forces its own vendors to adopt this new sort of Chinese OS. What about Chinese consumers? What if they just go, no, I'm into Android, I'm digging Android, I don't want to do that? Is it going to try and force consumers? Is it, that's a hell of a thing. That's a hell of a hill to die on.
They already restrict Google anyway.
I mean, let's not.
So
Let's not forget. 99% of Chinese residents won't have a choice if the Chinese government turns around and says, like Twitter or Facebook, you can't really operate those in that market without a VPN. If the Chinese government turns around and says, no, we don't want Android in China, no one has a choice.
No, I'm sure
if the US can restrict Huawei in America, then
totally.
Chinese
I'm sure they can do it. It just might exhaust. They might decide that's not the best way to exhaust whatever reserves of goodwill it has with its own population. But
I mean, I'm not entirely convinced the Chinese government gives a about what goodwill it has with the Chinese people either. So
there is that. So that's the operating system bit, and then this whole sort of banning thing is spreading. So yesterday, I think there's a story about ARM cutting off Huawei. Now, ARM was originally a UK company, and then it's bought by SoftBank, which is Japanese. So none of it is American. But I know it's got a major HQ in the States, and I certainly know when I used to bump into the current CEO, Simon Sagas, he was based in the States. So they've obviously got a big presence in the States.
Well, they say they have US origin technology.
Well, that's it.
And it's in this memo, which is very curious.
They've also got a lot.
Detail on that.
They've also got a lot of skin in the game when it comes to the T-Mobile Sprint merger. In that ARM
SoftBank
is owned by SoftBank and SoftBank owns Sprint.
We might circle back to that. But yes, that sort of stuff of US origin. So now we're getting into things like intellectual property. Now, how many people, for all I know, this plastic bottle's got some US intellectual property in the way it's moulded or something like that. It's now becoming very difficult to imagine that there's any product or service that might not conceivably have a US element to it. And everyone seems to be running scared and taking these very severe preemptive measures.
I mean, this is exactly what you alluded to before. I mean, this is why the idea of not being able to buy from the US is so much more catastrophic to Huawei than being able to sell in the US because
it's already largely cut off from the US as a market.
What business does it actually have in the US? Prior to 2019, I mean, it had something like 2% market share of the smartphone market, and it didn't have any major contracts from an infrastructure perspective. So there's going to be no material ban. It's
just got small rural carriers.
There's no material impact on the spreadsheets.
And that's why we got this little pause. So they said that they gave them a little 3-month window to sort their lives out, didn't they?
To stop sort of disruption happening for some of these customers.
But that doesn't seem to be of great significance in the broader scheme of things.
Well, I mean, you got certain companies that, because I was back in Wales when I was writing this story last week about the ban, and I was actually fortunate to be, my dad was in the room next door, and my dad is used to be a financial director for a company called HID, which is a high-tech security company, and there is a lot of manufacturing process there. And I said to him, and this is part of one of the consequences. A lot of US firms have got high levels of exposure to Huawei, and Huawei is one of their major customers. Like, for instance, a company called Neophotonics, which has 46% of its annual revenues is attributable to Huawei. Right. And I say, and there's a load of them like Lumentum, which has this 11% exposure. And I said to my dad, if you lose a customer which accounts for 11% of your business, as an FD, what would be your reaction? And he just turned around and he said, I myself. And he said 11% effectively writes out all of the profit for a year. You have to completely redefine your entire business model. And it's not just a case of firing a few people here and there. You've got to assess your own supply chain, because in your supply chain, if you're going to create a product for a customer, you've got to source raw materials. Now, you've got to go back to these original contracts with your suppliers and say, wait a minute, have we, by losing 10%, by decreasing our order 10%, are we going below a discount break that you're offering us? So all of a sudden, sourcing your materials could become a lot more expensive. There's a huge number of capacity on machines and facilities.
They both issued profit warnings today as well.
Those companies that we just mentioned. So that brings me to sort of the final thing that I just wrote about Huawei today, which is just reporting on an interview that, Wei told me the proper way to pronounce this. I always forget. So I'm just going to say
Ren Zhengfei.
But there's a better way. Anyway,
we can't do that.
No, he tells me it, but it won't stay in my head. I don't know what it is. Anyway, he did an interview with a bunch of Chinese media, pretty much all of whom were going to be sympathetic. They're either sort of directly controlled by the Communist Party or tend to know what side their bread's buttered on in terms of reporting. Absent was the South China Morning Post, which is Hong Kong based, which tends to be a little bit more critical, sort of pure journalistic. But notwithstanding the fact that he was probably going to get quite softball questions. In fact, at the end of the interview, at the end of this thing, which was written up by the Global Times, which is one of these controlled by the Communist Party ones, they went something like Huawei contributed to this. So basically, Huawei had editorial sign off on it. But notwithstanding all that, he said a lot of really interesting stuff. And so to distill it down, he seemed to be trying to make the point that he feels sorry for US manufacturers, that he pins all the blame on politicians and Donald Trump specifically, but he's making it clear that he wasn't burning any bridges with manufacturers, doesn't hold it against them, he feels sorry for them. And I thought that was quite clever. Firstly, just in a standard sort of divide and conquer tactic. Also to obviously not burn his bridges and keep his relationships there. But it probably is causing them a hell of a lot of pain. All this trade war stuff often harms you as much as it does the people that you think you're fighting.
I can't see anything but a net loss for everyone involved. I mean, I think the US are going to suffer in terms of its relationships with Europeans and South Korea, for instance. I know it's trying to muscle in at the moment. It's going to hurt its own companies. Google's going to be impacted very negatively. China's going to negatively. We're going to be impacted.
Look at the
everyone
stock
is a net
of all
loss.
These companies. They're all down. So
it's a net loss across the entire world.
I mean, the only way it turns into a positive is if the sort of Trump approach of sort of being belligerent and then meeting in the middle after actually does pay off, but there's not a lot of sign of it.
I can't see that happening now though, because people compare it to ZTE, but when ZTE got trade restrictions slapped on it last year, they'd sort of already paid a fine and then kind of owned up to, they eventually sort of admitted culpability for, for kind of wrongdoing by shipping components to Iran and North Korea.
Yes, quite. It was
you
a
can't
much
really
more
own
definite.
up to. Well, you can't own up to being a security threat, can you?
No.
they're not going to go, oh, that's all right, you're a security threat, pay a fine, and then we'll come.
That does remind me. There was only one bit where I think he misjudged, and he was being all sympathetic. And he was going, what can you do? You've got to do what your government tells you. And I suddenly thought, Ren, should you have said that? Given the big finger that's pointed at you is that Huawei's got to do what the Chinese government tells them.
Everybody knows that's very.
But it just struck me as a slight misstep in an otherwise fairly sort of slick set of answers. Anyway, I think we're running down on time. We're going to just do a quick one on the last story that we're going to chat about, which is, I can't remember when the merger between Sprint and T-Mobile US was first announced.
Summer 2017.
Was it? Okay, so we're 2 years down the line.
November 2017 maybe. It's 18 months.
We're a good chunk of time down the line, and it's still dragging on. And Jamie, you've written a couple of stories where it looked like on one side it was going to get pushed through, and then another side maybe not.
Well, we are miles over the 180-day stop clock, which the FCC gives itself to approve mergers and acquisitions. But basically, there's been a lot of concessions made by Sprint and T-Mobile to try and get the green lights from the final bodies which are going to approve the merger, which is the FCC and the Department of Justice, the DOJ. Right. So the concessions are, firstly, they'll sell off the Sprint prepaid brand Boost.
Okay.
Secondly, they will roll out a nationwide 5G network within a 3-year period. And finally, during this 3-year period, they will not raise prices anywhere.
Right.
So those
that's good enough for one set of people.
That was good enough for the FCC. So the FCC, so basically there's a split of objectives by the looks of it. So the FCC's objective is increasing coverage and connectivity options, or not connectivity options, connectivity quality. And it looks like the Department of Justice its objective is to maintain quite high levels of competition.
Right. So that's more like the European Commission. They get worried about.
So the 4-3 really scares the DOJ.
Right.
So the FCC have said, grand, we like these concessions, we greenlight it. Pi has turned around, and one of the commissioners, the two Democrats, are turning around and saying, we're not too sure.
Yeah.
But it actually really does not matter whatsoever. They only need a majority, and all the Republicans will say yes. And the DOJ have turned around and said, actually, we're not too happy about these concessions.
Right. They're not enough.
It's not enough.
Have they said what would be enough?
It's all raw reports and sources.
Right. Okay.
So they haven't actually come out and given a concrete position right yet. But the perhaps the most interesting thing about this is that this is the first ever time that the DOJ and the FCC have got different opinions when it comes to approving mergers. They usually sing off the same song sheet, and there might be some different nuances, but usually they're both exactly the same, yes, no. This is the first time they've come into conflict. So, and I just think it is down to the case that the FCC is focusing on connectivity and in terms of coverage and quality, and the DOJ is focused on competition and protecting the consumer.
Seems like a pretty good summary to me.
I think that is the fundamental difference.
Do you think it will get blocked or ever go through? Do you have a gut feel about it?
As it stands, I've got a feeling it will get blocked. I think the longer this process goes on, the more likely it will get turned down. I get the impression that they're not assessing the information in front of them. They're looking for a reason to say no.
Yeah.
That's my gut feel, because if they were just purely assessing the information which is directly in front of them now, a decision would have been made, yes or no. It seems to me that they are genuinely...
Very drawn out, isn't
it? I mean, 18 months when they give themselves a 180-day limit to start with. I mean, it's ridiculous. I get the impression they're looking for a reason to say no.
What about you, Iain? Do you have a gut feel about how this process is going to play out?
I've heard from colleagues sort of in the US who cover it that they expect it to be blocked.
Right.
So
if we're collectively putting money on it, we'd go for blocked, it looks like at the moment. I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other, but I'll go with you guys.
Yeah, I mean, if the DOJ is that opposed to it on competition grounds, then, and that's always been the strong argument against it anyway. I mean, there is a case for doing it on the basis of connectivity. You can sort of, which is what the companies themselves have always said, if we kind of pool forces, then we can build a 5G network more quickly, and that's quite compelling at the moment when there's all this worry about falling behind China in 5G, if it becomes this.
What is worth noting on that network is that they said the 3-year network would be used in low and mid-band spectrum. So although you're going to get the coverage gain, you're going to get the coverage play for 5G. You're not going to get the high band speeds which are guaranteed.
So you won't be playing Wizards Unite.
Yeah.
On the 4-to-3 thing generally, I think if in every geography, and bear in mind that we know there are parts of the States, certainly in the fixed line, where there's almost no choice whatsoever.
No. Yeah.
I think if in every geography you had a choice between 3 players, I still think that constitutes.
I think that constitutes competition. Yes.
I don't know if it is that though, is it?
No, there's so many
gaps, and
so that'll be part of the concern.
There's so many regionalised monopolies.
You know, in Europe, there's also a lot more MVNOs as well that bring competition, have driven down prices.
But in the UK, if they'd merged 3 and 0.2, I don't think that would be an issue.
The big problem with MVNOs in the States, though, is that they're not genuine MVNOs. So when you buy a phone contract from an MVNO, that SIM card is strictly tied to the network with the wholesale
so it's just
relationship.
A veneer over
so it's
the
just
MNO.
It's basically a brand. You know, in Europe, if the underlying, or if Leica Mobile, for instance, wants to change its underlying network, that has no impact on the SIM that's on your phone. They can just swap it out. Whereas Sprint, for instance, if it's changed from T-Mobile, it's on the T-Mobile network now. Let's say it went across to Verizon, which is highly unlikely. They would have to swap out every single SIM card. Boost SIM cards, but because they're all prepaid and you don't have ties to the customer, sometimes you don't even know who these customers are. You don't know where the SIM cards are. It's incredibly complicated. So this Boost concession, I mean, it'll effectively remain a business tied to T-Mobile anyway. So I just think it's
not
very
much of a concession.
No, it's a very paper concession.
All right, I'm gonna wrap it up there, partly because quite soon we've got to go off to the next Telecoms.com meetup, which will have happened by the time you're listening to this.
So you can't invite people.
So, it's too late. Too late, you missed out. But yeah, it's our 3rd one that we're doing, just to plug it, on a sort of every couple of months.
This is the next one.
Going to the pub, putting the card behind the bar and getting them in. So that should be good fun, and so maybe the podcast after this, we'll talk about how that went. So thanks again, guys, thanks for coming in, and thank you very much for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.